As they walked out, Shaq leaned against the doorframe, watching them disappear down the street. He knew this wasn't the end of Jay's journey. There would still be struggles, still be hard days. But for the first time in a long time, Jay wasn't alone. And that made all the difference. Shaq smiled to himself, stepping back inside. Sometimes life comes full circle. And sometimes all it takes is one person to remind you that you still matter. Jay's voice, hesitant at first, grew stronger. His words, raw and honest, carried a weight that even Shaq hadn't expected. When they finished, Jay exhaled deeply. That was weirdly freeing. Shaq smirked. Told you. Jay glanced at the camera. You really think people will care? Shaq's smile faded slightly. People need to care. That night, they edited the footage. It was rough, unpolished, but real. And something told Shaq that this was only the beginning. But neither of them knew that by the next day, everything would change in a way they never saw coming. The next morning, Shaq woke up to his phone buzzing nonstop. At first, he thought it was just his usual notifications, texts, emails, maybe a few calls. But when he picked it up, his eyes widened. His video with Jay had gone viral. Not just a few thousand views, hundreds of thousands. Comments were pouring in from everywhere. People sharing their own struggles, others offering support, some in complete shock that someone like Jay had fallen on hard times. The response was overwhelming. Shaq turned to Jay, who was still half asleep on the couch. Bruv, you need to see this. Jay groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. See what? Shaq handed him the phone. Jay scrolled for a few seconds, then froze. His fingers tightened around the device as he read the comments. Asterisk, this is heartbreaking, but so real. Asterisk. Asterisk, I had no idea things like this could happen to someone so talented. Asterisk. Asterisk, Jay, we see you, bro. Stay strong. Asterisk. Asterisk, we need to do something to help him. Asterisk. Jay swallowed hard, blinking as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. People actually care, he muttered under his breath. Shaq grinned. Told you. But that was only the beginning. Over the next few hours, donations started coming in. Small at first, £5 here, £10 there. But then the numbers grew. Someone set up a GoFundMe for Jay, and before long, it had reached thousands of pounds. People were offering job opportunities, housing assistance, things Jay had never imagined would be within reach again. Jay was speechless. He kept shaking his head, his fingers hovering over the screen as if touching the words would make them more real. I don't know what to say, he finally whispered. Shaq put a hand on his shoulder. Say thank you. And get ready, 'cause your life's about to change. But just as they were soaking it all in, Shaq's phone rang. He answered without thinking. Michael. The voice on the other end was deep, serious. Shaq sat up straighter. Yeah, who's this? It's Daniel, Jay's older brother. Shaq's stomach flipped. He hadn't spoken to Daniel in years. We need to talk, Daniel continued. Where's Jay? Shaq hesitated, glancing at Jay. He's here with me. What's going on? A long pause. Then Daniel exhaled sharply. I need to see him. Now. Jay, who had been listening, suddenly stiffened. I don't know if that's a good idea, he muttered, shaking his head. But something in Daniel's voice told Shaq this wasn't just a casual conversation. Come to my place, Shaq said. An hour later, there was a knock at the door. Jay took a deep breath before opening it. Daniel stood there, taller than Jay, broader with the same deep-set eyes. His expression was a mix of relief, guilt, and something else, something heavier. Jay, he said, voice tight. Jay swallowed. Hey. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then, without warning, Daniel pulled Jay into a tight hug. I've been looking for you, man, Daniel murmured. Jay tensed at first, but slowly he let himself relax. I didn't think you cared, Jay admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel pulled back, shaking his head. I did. I always did. But when you disappeared, I didn't know where to start. And when I finally found out you were homeless, he trailed off, his jaw tightening. I felt like I failed you. Jay looked down, his fingers twitching. I should have reached out. Daniel sighed. We both should have. Shock watched silently, knowing this was a moment they needed. After a long pause, Daniel took a deep breath. Come home, Jay. Jay flinched. Home? You don't have to do this alone anymore, Daniel said firmly. Mom and Dad, they miss you. I miss you. We can fix this, together. Jay's eyes glistened. You sure? Daniel nodded. Yeah, I'm sure. For the first time in a long time, Jay let out a deep, shaky breath, like he had been holding it in for years. He turned to Shaq, who just gave him a knowing nod. Go, Shaq said simply. Jay laughed softly. You always trying to boss me around. Shaq smirked. That's what brothers do. Jay turned back to Daniel. All right, let's go home. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the living room. Shaq stretched, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, then glanced over at Jay, who was still asleep on the couch. For the first time in a long while, his friend looked at peace. No restless shifting, no tense shoulders bracing against the cold. Just calm. Shaq exhaled. He had spent half the night thinking about what to do next. One thing was clear, he couldn't just let Jay go back to the streets. But fixing this wasn't as simple as giving him a place to crash. The situation ran deeper. Jay stirred, blinking awake. He looked around, almost disoriented for a second, as if he had forgotten where he was. Then he sat up, rubbing his face. Man, that was the best sleep I've had in ages, he muttered, stretching his arms. Shaq chuckled. That's what happens when you're not sleeping on a bench, you know. Jay smirked, but there was a sadness in his eyes. Yeah, thanks, bruv. Shaq waved it off. Listen, we need to talk. You're not going back out there. We gotta sort things out. Jay sighed, leaning back. Shaq, I appreciate everything, man. But I don't want to be a burden. Shaq's expression hardened. Stop that. I don't want to hear it. You're my brother. This ain't about charity. It's about looking out for each other. Jay nodded slowly, but Shaq could see the hesitation, the weight of pride mixed with the reality of his situation. He had always been like that. Even back in the day, Jay never wanted to take handouts. He was the type to struggle in silence rather than ask for help. And now that same pride had kept him suffering alone. Shaq sat forward. Tell me something. When was the last time you really had a chance? Like a real opportunity. Jay hesitated, then shrugged. Years ago, maybe. Had a decent job. Things were stable. Then life flipped the script on me. One bad thing after another. You know how it goes. Shaq nodded. He did know. The world wasn't fair. Some people caught breaks. Others just kept getting hit with losses. I want to help you get back on your feet, Shaq said. Not just for a night. For good. Jay looked at him, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. How though? It's not that easy, man. Shaq leaned back, thinking. Let's start with something simple. A fresh start. A new job. I know people. Let me make some calls. Jay exhaled. You really think that's enough? A job. You think people see me the same way now. You don't get it, Shaq. Once you fall, people stop looking at you the same. Shaq frowned. Who cares what people think? They don't know you. They don't know your story. Jay scoffed. Nah, bruv. You're famous now. You don't see it. You walk into a room, people listen. Me, I walk in and they see someone who's been on the streets. Someone they don't trust. That's just the truth. Shaq fell silent. He hated that Jay was right. He could give him a couch to sleep on, buy him food, even set up job interviews. But society had already judged Jay, and that wasn't something money or connections could easily change. Shaq drummed his fingers on the table, deep in thought. Then an idea hit him. What if we flip the script? He said suddenly. Jay raised a brow. What do you mean? Shaq grinned. What if we show people who you really are? Not just some guy who's been through hard times, but the real you. The Jay I know. The one who's funny, smart, talented. What if we take control of the story before anyone else does? Jay looked at him warily. And how exactly do we do that? Shaq leaned forward, excitement building. We tell it ourselves. On camera. Jay's eyes widened. Wait, what? Shaq nodded. We document this. We show people what life is really like. No sugarcoating. No pity. Just the truth. The journey back up. You've got a voice, bro, and people need to hear it. Jay stared at him, processing. So you want to turn my life into content? Shaq shook his head. Nah, I want to turn your story into inspiration. Think about it. How many people out there are struggling like you? Feeling invisible, feeling like nobody cares. We could change that. Show them they're not alone. Jay rubbed his chin, clearly torn. I dunno, man. Being in front of a camera, that's your thing, not mine. Shaq shrugged. Doesn't have to be fancy. Just real. Raw. We don't even need to post it if you're not comfortable. But just try. Let's record a little something. See how it feels. Jay hesitated, then sighed. All right. But if it feels weird, we drop it. Shaq grinned. Deal. That day, they set up a small recording in Shaq's apartment. Nothing scripted, nothing flashy. Just Jay talking, sharing his story. The struggle, the setbacks, the reality of what it meant to lose everything. And as the camera rolled, something shifted. It was a crisp evening in London, the kind where the city lights danced on the damp pavement, and the air carried the distant hum of life moving forward. Michael DePauw, better known to the world as Big Shaq, was cruising through the familiar streets of his old neighborhood, a place that still held echoes of his childhood. He had just wrapped up a long day of work, a mix of studio sessions and meetings, but something pulled him back here. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was something deeper. As he rolled past the local chicken shop where he and his boys used to hang out after school, memories flooded back. Laughter, late-night debates about football, the smell of crispy fries, and peri-peri wings. All of it felt so close, yet so far. That's when he saw him. At first, it was just a shadowy figure on the corner, hunched over with a hoodie pulled tight against the cold. People walked past without a second glance, lost in their own worlds. But something about the way the man held himself, the slight tilt of his head, it struck a chord. Big Shaq slowed down, peering through the window, trying to get a better look. Then it hit him. That face, those eyes. It was Jay. Jay, his childhood best friend. The one who had always been by his side, through thick and thin, rain or shine. They had dreams together, dreams of making it big, of proving everyone wrong. Jay was the one who used to freestyle with him in the schoolyard, hyping him up when nobody else believed in him. But now, here he was, on the streets. Shaq's heart clenched. He quickly pulled over and stepped out, the cold air hitting him like a slap. As he approached, he could see the exhaustion in Jay's face, the rough stubble on his chin, the worn-out clothes that barely provided warmth. "Jay." Shaq's voice was cautious, uncertain, as if he was afraid he might be mistaken. Jay looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of recognition and disbelief. "Shaq." His voice was rough, tired. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavier than words. What are you doing out here?" Shaq finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jay let out a small, bitter chuckle. "Life, bro, life happened." Shaq felt his stomach twist. How had things gotten this bad? The last time he had seen Jay, he was working a decent job, had a place of his own. What had happened? I didn't know, bruv," Shaq said, shaking his head. "How long?" Jay shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "A while." Shaq exhaled sharply, his mind racing. This wasn't just some random guy. This was Jay. The same Jay who used to dream big with him. The same Jay who had his back through everything. "You eaten today?" Shaq asked suddenly. Jay hesitated, then shook his head. Shaq didn't even think twice. "Come on, let's go." Jay looked at him, wary. "You don't have to, man." Shaq scoffed. "Bruv, don't even start. Come." Without another word, he led Jay to his car, opening the passenger door for him. As they drove, Shaq's mind was spinning. How had this happened? How had Jay ended up here? And why hadn't he reached out? Over dinner at a quiet little spot, Jay slowly opened up. His job had downsized, leaving him without work. Then came the bills, the missed rent payments, the eviction. He tried to get back on his feet, but one thing led to another, and before he knew it, he had nowhere to go. Shaq listened, his heart aching for his friend. He couldn't believe how much had changed in just a few years. "Why didn't you call me?" Shaq asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Jay sighed, pushing his food around on the plate. "Pride, man. I didn't want to be that guy, coming to you only when I'm down." Shaq shook his head. "Bruv, that's what friends are for." Jay looked up, and for the first time that night, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Hope? Relief? Maybe a mix of both. Shaq made a decision right then and there. He wasn't just going to buy Jay dinner and drop him off back on the streets. No way. "You're coming with me tonight," he said firmly. "You're not sleeping out there." Jay hesitated. "Shaq, I can't." "I'm not asking," Shaq interrupted. End of discussion. Jay exhaled, defeated but grateful. "All right." That night, Jay crashed at Shaq's place, finally getting a proper night's sleep for the first time in months. And as Shaq watched his childhood friend resting on the couch, he knew this wasn't over. He couldn't just help Jay for one night and call it a day. The next morning, Shaq had a plan. But nothing could have prepared him for the shock that was waiting for him.